So hi everyone, I'm Sylvain Longhais. I'm research assistant at the Cyberjustice Laboratory of the Université de Montréal. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar called Ethical Issues in Cybersecurity Beyond Privacy and Security. To present this webinar, this activity, I'm very pleased to welcome Ivo van der Poel, professor in ethics and technology at the Delft University of Technology. Good afternoon, Professor van der Poel. Thank you very much for being with us today. So today's webinar is halfway between a conference and a talk. So we're going to start with a small lecture, about 10 minutes, that will allow you to better understand what will be discussed next. And then the talk part will be a series of questions related to the topic in order to deepen our understanding about this topic. So without any further ado, Professor van der Poel, if you want to play the video. And have a good listening, everyone, and we'll see each other right after the lecture.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvain. I will share my screen and share the video. Let me see. Share. I think you should now be able to see it, and I will start it.
More dilemmas. Cybersecurity.
Does it work?
It works perfectly for
me.
I think it works for
privacy versus security. If we want more security, we have to give up some privacy. However, privacy and security are not always conflicting, but sometimes are supportive. Moreover, a range of other values are at stake in cybersecurity. In this lecture, we will move beyond the dichotomy between privacy and security by discussing a broader range of values, potential value conflicts between these values, and how to deal with such conflicts. Many values can be discerned in relation to cybersecurity. For example, in the literature study we did for the Canvas project, we found a large number of value terms in the domains of health, business, and national security in relation to cybersecurity. In order to create a bit more order, I propose to introduce the notion of value cluster. A value cluster is a range of values that express similar moral concerns. Moreover, the values that are part of a value cluster are typically articulated in response to similar moral problems. In relation to cybersecurity, 4 value clusters can be discerned: security, privacy, fairness, and accountability. In very general terms, security may be understood as the state of being free from danger or threat. Often we speak about the security of a certain entity X from a specific kind of danger I. Here, X can refer to an individual, a person, but also to a collective social entities like an organization, a business, or a state. X may also refer to a technical system like a computer system. Depending on the X, we can thus distinguish more specific types of security like personal security, national security, and computer security. A second relevant value cluster is privacy. When it comes to cybersecurity, privacy is usually understood in informational terms. Such informational privacy is about what information about a person should be kept confidential and not be shared with others. Some notions of privacy stress the confidentiality or secrecy of information, while other notions stress control over what information is shared with whom. This cluster contains, in addition to privacy, such values as moral autonomy, human dignity, identity, personhood, liberty, anonymity, and confidentiality. A third cluster is that of fairness. Fairness has a number of relevant aspects. First, it is about a fair distribution of costs and benefits. For example, cybersecurity measures should not only come at the expense of one group in society. Second, it is about equal access to basic rights and goods. One may wonder, in an information society, if there is not a basic right to internet services with a minimal level of cybersecurity. Third, fairness is about equal treatment or non-discrimination. And fourth, we also include here democratic rights. Now, other values that belong to the cluster of fairness include justice, fairness, equality, accessibility, freedom from bias, non-discrimination, democracy, and the protection of civil liberties. Now the fourth cluster. This is about accountability. Values in this cluster include transparency, openness, and explainability. Accountability is here understood as the obligation to account for one's actions, choices, and for outcomes. This is important because cybersecurity measures taken by, for example, governments can potentially harm citizens. Okay, let us now look at a number of value conflicts in cybersecurity. A value conflict is here understood as a situation in which one needs to choose between at least two options. Moreover, there are at least two different values that select different options as best. Now, there are several general strategies to deal with conflicting values. I will briefly discuss 4 of them. First, we can balance the values at stake by making trade-offs between them. We may, for example, give up some privacy to attain security. What makes this balancing difficult is that values might be incommensurable and they do not have a common denominator. So it is hard to determine a right balance. A second approach is to set a minimal threshold for each value. This ensures that we respect each value to a minimal degree. Then, a third approach is to reason about the values and to find a common denominator so that we can specify what the values imply in a given context in such a way that they can be met simultaneously. The final approach is what we call innovation. This means that we look for new technological or institutional possibilities so that we can meet the conflicting values simultaneously. Let us now return to cybersecurity. If we take the 4 value clusters, for each of the relations between them, we may discuss where these values are mainly conflicting or reinforcing. I will restrict myself here to the relations that involve the value of security. Here the most often mentioned conflict is that between privacy and security. However, closer examination shows that the relation between security and privacy is not always conflicting. In computer systems, privacy requires some degree of cybersecurity. Privacy sets limits on who has access to what information. And without cybersecurity, these limits cannot be maintained. And personal information will be subject to unauthorized access. Conversely, privacy sometimes contributes to security. For example, if certain information about use of a system is kept confidential, spear phishing attacks can no longer leverage excessive available user information to choose attack targets. Still, the question remains what to do if privacy and security are conflicting. One approach here is reasoning and specification. If one looks at privacy and security, it seems that the conflict is most salient if all data are gathered or if no data are gathered. If all data are gathered or monitored, security is achieved at the cost of privacy. But on the other hand, if no data is gathered or monitored, privacy is achieved at the cost of security. This suggests that the conflict boils down to conflicting requirements about what data should be collected, stored, and shared for what purpose. This means that in looking for potential solutions to the value conflict, we should put central stage questions like how much data and what data need to be gathered? What data should be accessible to whom? For how long should we store these data? Now, let us now look at another value conflict, that between security and accountability. In as far as accountability requires a revelation of what cybersecurity measures are exactly taken, it may be at tension with cybersecurity itself. The reason for this tension is that cybersecurity threats often do not just arise from unintentional harm, but from the actions of malicious agents. These agents will typically strategically adapt their malicious strategies to what cybersecurity measures are being taken. In this sense, cybersecurity is like an arms race. This means that too much public accountability may undermine the effectiveness of cybersecurity measures. How are we to deal with this value conflict? While this tension may require some form of balancing or trade-off, there are also institutional innovations that may help to elevate the tension. One example is to create fora for accountability that do not require full public disclosure. Then, a third value conflict. Security may also be conflicting with fairness and democracy, in particular when cybersecurity is used for national security aims. Examples are large state surveillance programs or cyber attacks on other countries by government agencies. Such activities may put at risk civil liberties and the privacy of citizens. Sometimes this may be justified, but it would require at least some form of democratic legitimation and accountability. However, the fact that these activities are often secretive makes democratic legitimation and accountability often hard to achieve. Fairness would also require that some minimal level of basic rights, including a certain right to personal security, civil liberties, and privacy protection, is guaranteed for all. Here, a possible approach to the value conflict would be to set minimal threshold for the values at stake. In particular, it would seem important to guarantee some minimal level of fairness so that security measures do not endanger basic liberal rights. Now, let me summarize the main points from this lecture. If we want to deal with value conflicts in cybersecurity, we should first of all understand what these relevant values are. And I've discussed 4 relevant value clusters: security, privacy, fairness, and accountability. Second, we should understand whether these values are mutually supportive or potentially conflicting. I've discussed this for some pairs of values, but we can indeed further extend this to, for example, the relation between fairness and privacy. Third, I've presented ways to deal with these conflicting values. Often, there's not a simple or straightforward answer to the question how to deal with value conflicts. However, the methods that I presented help to think more systematically about how to address value conflicts in cybersecurity.
I think you're muted.
Indeed, thank you. So before we start the questions, like, would you like to introduce yourself a bit more, or you know?
I can certainly do so. So my name is Ibo van der Poel. I'm a professor in ethics and technology at the Technical University in Delft in the Netherlands. My work broadly focuses on ethics of technology. That includes, I'm doing things on cybersecurity also, but also many other different technologies like biotechnology, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence. I'm particularly interested in issues around values, and also how we can take values that are morally important into account in the design of new technologies. So a lot of my work is about what's called value-sensitive design and responsible innovation. And that's very much about how can we, if we develop or design new technologies, already think about the values, and how can we, in a way, embody them in the technology. And also how can we think about value conflicts or values that might be changing over time. So these are the type of issues that I'm particularly interested in.
Thank you very much. So we hear a lot of about values, but so it's going to be my first question. It's perfect. Can you tell us more about these values? What are values, in fact, and what features would you give to them regarding cybersecurity? And also, are values in cybersecurity supposed to be attached to, you know, to goodness, feasibility, or anything else?
Yeah. So let me say a bit in general about how I understand. So the notion of value is very much used in many disciplines, actually. So it is used, my background is more in philosophy, but it's also used in sociology, in I think also in law. And what is sometimes confusing is that people don't exactly mean the same as values in these disciplines. But I think in general, you can say values are about what is good or what is desirable, things that we find we should aim for. And particular in ethical research, we don't look for values just to describe the values of people, but we try to denote things that are from a kind of moral point of view you should aim for. So they have a normative meaning. So they things that are good or desirable to aim for. And that can include moral values, but it can, in a sense, the notion is used broader than more. So it can also be beauty is also a value, or truth is a value. And even something like feasibility can to some extent be a value in as far as it denotes something that is desirable to achieve. So it's a very broad notion of value, but it always refers to things that are, in a sense, good or desirable.
Okay, thank you very much. And so does the idea of value cluster that you present, does the idea stem from the idea of emphasizing the most relevant values amongst like a plurality of values, like here in the domain of cybersecurity? Or how did security, privacy, fairness, and accountability like specifically emerge from this plurality of values?
Yeah. So that's so the reason I talk about these value clusters is if you look at the range of values that is potentially relevant for cybersecurity, you can make a long list, maybe even like 20 values or maybe even more. I mean, depending on how specific you make them. And I thought it would be helpful, not to have too many in order to discuss them a bit comprehensively or focused. And also, if you want to talk about value conflict, so what I try to do, and this is the idea of value cluster, that some values, at least in relation to cybersecurity, are similar, and they can be similar in two respects. So one respect is that they express similar moral concerns. So, for example, if you take values like privacy and autonomy, they must have to do with protecting the life sphere of an individual, of creating room for an individual to be who he or she wants to be. So on the one hand, they express similar moral concerns. And the other thing you might say, they are kind of response to similar moral problems. So things that might go wrong with for example, in the domain of computer technologies, is that information gets shared where it doesn't belong. And the idea was that these value clusters are similar in terms of what type of more problems they arise to. I'm not saying that you cannot organize them differently. I mean, you can always debate that, but that's what I try to do, coming with these four clusters, actually having the four main clusters of more concerns around cybersecurity. That was my aim. In delineating those four clusters.
Okay, yeah, that explains a lot. Thank you for this this presentation. So on these value clusters, for example, can we find same values in different value clusters? For instance, confidentiality is a value of security, but also of privacy. And so are common values the grounds for supportive value clusters? Security and privacy are not only conflicting, but also supportive, as you said. So what would you?
No, I think that's, so this may be good here. So sometimes philosophers make this distinction between what they call more instrumental values and more intrinsic values. And the intrinsic values are the values that are important in themselves, and the instrumental values are values that help to achieve other values. Now, I think that the intrinsic values are somewhat different between the clusters, but some of the instrumental values are similar between the clusters. For example, like you say, a value like confidentiality actually is instrumental to cybersecurity, but must also be instrumental to privacy. And indeed, in this way, you can understand why these value clusters are also supportive to each other, because they have, in particular, I think, the more instrumental values they share.
Okay, and so we talk about a lot about the security, and which is like a big part of your work. And what difference would you make between security and safety, for example? What would be the...
Yeah, so the distinction that I usually use, although it is not always applied, I usually use safety for cases of unintentional harm and security for cases of intentional harm. So that means that if you talk about, although I think in the case of cybersecurity, we typically use cybersecurity both for what I here call safety and security, because we use cybersecurity typically not only if there is some perpetrator or some criminal or whatever cyber attack, but also if the machinery breaks down or the computer doesn't function well or the data gets destroyed. And that would be, at least in how it is often used, more a safety issue than a security issue. So I would normally say safety is unintentional harm, security is intentional harm. Although I think and that might still also be for cybersecurity be useful, because what you have to do about it is different for safety and security often, because in case of security, you need to take into account that there is somebody who wants to do harm. So you can make protections, but you always have to be aware that there is someone who's aiming to break these protections, so to say. And that's of course not the case with safety. Then there is not another party who wants to do harm. There is just something happening that creates harm. So therefore, I think the distinction is different. But I think often the term cybersecurity is used for both, although some people distinguish it. I hope this answers the question.
Yes, totally. Thank you very much. And so, so we use cybersecurity, but actually that could be cybersecurity safety.
Yeah.
So, so could you detail about the informational privacy regarding cybersecurity? What does this term involve?
Yeah. So the term informational privacy is usually used to refer to privacy that relates to information. So that means we use informational privacy if we talk about that certain information should not be shared with others or should remain confidential. We might nowadays think that's all there is to privacy, but actually privacy also have, for example, can have a spatial meaning. If we private in our room, we don't want people to enter, for example, and this is not so much about information, but about room for ourselves. So actually privacy is much broader than informational privacy, but of course related to computer systems and related to cybersecurity, the informational is very important. And the informational often is also very much related to cybersecurity, at least in the sense that to protect, so if we have certain information and we don't want it to be shared with some people, we of course need some form of cybersecurity to guarantee that. And that's also why often I think cybersecurity and privacy are mutually reinforcing or supporting each other, because without some form of cybersecurity, we don't have privacy. On the other hand, we sometimes have conflicts because, for example, if cyber attacks take place, we might need to monitor internet traffic, for example, and that might involve privacy intrusions doing that. So that means that they can also be conflicting in terms of what information you collect.
So like informational privacy is really related to data finally. Like
yeah,
eventually.
that's right. Okay. It's very, that is largely about data. Although we need to be aware that even if data is anonymized, we of course, we can sometimes find out even, so it is about the data, but also with what meaning we can give to these data, so to say.
Okay, so not only personal data, but also impersonal data that can become personal data.
So, I mean, even if data is in itself not personal, in a certain context or with certain additional data, they might become personal, so to say.
Okay. Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So could you provide an example that would explain the distribution of cost and benefits regarding the value cluster of fairness?
Yeah, I can say so. So indeed, one of the values I'm discussing is fairness, and this has different meanings, as I also said in the talk. But one important thing has to do with the distribution of costs and benefits. Now you might think in terms of cyber, you might think of, in a sense, very straightforward things. So, for example, if you're doing internet banking, and somehow your account gets corrupted, or what also happens that people give it to criminals. You have this phishing, and you might say you have a breach of cybersecurity, so people can get money from your account. And there is of course a question then: who is to bear the cost of this cybersecurity breach? Is this the bank, or is this the one using the user, so to say? And this is a very clear justice issue, I think. But also, who is responsible for upholding enough cybersecurity? I think oftentimes we expect users to do all kinds of things, to remember all kinds of very complex passwords, or not to have the same password for different sites. I think we know all these examples. But you can wonder, and in a sense, I mean, this is not about monetary cost, but this is about efforts that are required by different parties. And you can wonder whether this should be the responsibility of the users, or it should be the responsibility of the provider of the system. Now, these are typically fairness questions. Where are these costs to be borne, and what is the most, say, fair way of distributing these costs between different parties?
Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so, speaking of accountability now, is there a distinction between the accountability, like ex ante, the way to prevent the problems, and the accountability ex post, like after the damage is done?
I think there isn't. So first, let's say accountability ex post. So afterwards, if something has gone wrong, in general, I would say there is a form of accountability. For example, on the one providing the ICT service to give an explanation, and that's what accountability means: is giving an explanation or giving an account of what happened. So I think certainly, if damage has been done to people, their privacy has been intruded, or like in a bank case, they lost money, I think the provider of the service has accountability to these people and have to explain what went wrong, why it went wrong. And that's mainly ex post accountability. I think in some cases there is what you might call ex ante, dus explain beforehand. And that especially is the case, I think, if you're taking measures that are an intrusion on civil rights of people, for example. So sometimes it might be necessary in order to safeguard cybersecurity, but also to safeguard, for example, national security, to make intrusions on the rights of people. But I think that can only be done if there's some legitimation for that. And I think this legitimation also needs to involve some form of accountability, some form of at least political or public explaining why these measures are being taken and why these measures are being seen as proportional. And you might call this ex ante accountability. Nothing has gone wrong yet, but you're in a sense intruding, certainly if it is about civil liberties or important individual rights. I think that ex ante accountability is also quite important.
So just to summarize, like all these value clusters are very linked together, and like works between like they work between each other. And so how these value clusters in cybersecurity would help to overcome like the traditional opposition we have between privacy and security, which is one like a problem also in law. So how would that help to overcome this opposition?
Yeah, so I think the framework I tries to overcome this opposition basically in two ways. So one thing that it tries to do is saying, well, if you look more precisely, it is not the case that privacy and accountability, privacy and security are necessarily conflicting. Sometimes they support each other. Sometimes they help each other. They both need it sometimes. So that is one thing to be aware of. And the other thing is that it says, well, if we focus only on privacy and security, we actually were getting very important other moral values. So like the value of fairness and like the value of accountability. And certainly in my framework, these relate to yet other values because they're value clusters. So, but I think that is really important because if we focus, for example, only on privacy and security, privacy very much focuses on individuals. But I think that also like these fairness issues, which are about more societal issues, about distribution between individuals. And I think it is very important also to take these moral issues into account and not just to focus on privacy versus security. Or to say it otherwise, maybe even if it is acceptable in terms of privacy and security, it might still be unfair, or there might be a lack of accountability, and that would still be a moral problem, so to say.
Yeah, so we don't like, this is a way to escape the trap to to just like see this distinction between security and privacy, and maybe just get something more into the problematics. And
really I think that indeed, and maybe partly it arrives also from the fact that privacy is, at least in Europe, but I think also many other countries, is now much better laid down in laws. So it becomes something you have to do from a legal point of view, which is in a sense very good. But it might also sometimes mean that it seems that is the only thing to address, and you can forget about these other things. And I think that's also very important to be aware that it's not just doing it ethically good, so to say. It's not just a matter of having cybersecurity and addressing privacy, but it's also addressing a number of other concerns. And I think that's important to be aware of.
Thank you very much. And yeah, we present these value clusters and all the implications. And one thing in your lecture is the value conflicts. And so how important is it to define the interpretation of values in order to detect the potential value conflicts? Would it, by the way, help to find the best strategy to deal with value conflicts?
Yeah, so let me say a few things on that. I think the interpretation of values is really important to understand where are value conflicts. And sometimes also, if you think deeper about what values exactly mean, there might sometimes be less value conflict than you think. So, for example, you might think that, so one argument you might give is that if you have a tension between privacy and accountability, there might be a certain tension because to account for things, you have to reveal certain things about a person. And you might argue revealing anything about a person is an intrusion of this person's privacy and restricts this person's autonomy. But if you understand autonomy not just as absolute freedom, but understand autonomy more as the ability to behave in a responsible way, then you would say, well, some privacy intrusions or are maybe not even intrusions or are less bad than other privacy intrusions because they belong to what you're supposed to account to others. So if you put it in that light, you might see that conflict is maybe a less severe conflict than another type of conflict. And that is why I think understanding what you mean with these values in a particular situation is really important to see whether there's really a value conflict or there seems only to be a value conflict. I hope I'm clear in explaining this, but
no, you're very clear. So this it's really interesting, and then helps to find the best strategy. Like if you actually did that before, like the interpretation. So we can see clearly how
Yeah.
important it is. And so at what stage, because we also have these things about value conflicts, but more pragmatically, I'd say, at what stage do we detect such value conflicts in cybersecurity, and what tools to use to do so, to detect the value conflicts?
Yeah. So let me. Yeah. So I think ideally we should try to identify value conflicts as early on as possible. And the reason has to do with, so like I said, much of work what I'm doing, but also colleagues of mine are doing in Delft in philosophy of technology, is so we focus on what we call value sensitive design. And the idea of that is that we as early as possible detect the values that are important if we design a technology or make a cybersecurity measure. We want to know it as early as possible. And we actually also want to know possible conflicts as early as possible, because if we identify them early on, we might be able to find also sometimes new technical solutions or new institutional solutions that solve the value conflict. But we can, of course, only do so if we very early on detect these value conflicts. So I would say in general, we want to detect them as early as possible so that we can think of better options and better solutions. Of course, this is not always possible. Sometimes we might detect it later, and we should also be open to that. But if possible, we should try to find it as soon as possible and to think what it means for possible better solutions, technical as well as institutional.
And so yeah, it's in the early stage. This is actually what law try to do in a way. If you have, for example, like the GDPR, that would require at some point like what they call like an impact assessment.
Yeah.
Would you think like, for example, we could like include this kind of work, this kind of detection in this impact assessments, because it's also closely related to cybersecurity, right?
Yeah. No. I think we can, and I think impact assessment can also be helpful in detecting these conflicts. What's very important is that what sometimes happens, and this is more generally true of impact, but also risk assessments, that people see it more as a kind of obligations. They have to do it, but they just do it to show it. Okay, there's no huge impact, there's no huge risk, and it is okay. While I think it is much more interesting to think, well, first of all, you should think seriously about it anyway, but you should also see it as a kind of interesting challenge for your technological design. So you should be, so I think there is a bit of a danger that these activities like impact and risk assessment become something that's just seen as an obligation or a list that you have to tick off, and then it is good. I don't think that's the way you should see it. You should see it as something that actually can help also technological design better. And I think that shift is still very hard. My impression is that often the GDPR is often much more seen as a kind of checklist than as something that can inform better design. And that's, of course, what you would want, I would say.
Yes, exactly. Like you would imagine that requiring such an impact assessment would be like, okay, so you do your part of the job, but you do it seriously, and we want like a better data protection. We don't want you to just do this checklist. That's not why the law was actually made. But is there like in definitive, because so you presented different strategies to deal with value conflicts, and so in definitive, is there a best option or at least a most used option to deal with value conflicts, or does it really depend on the situation? For example, in value conflict of security and fairness, you mentioned like minimal threshold, but the method of balancing could also be used. So what would you say about that, about like the best approach to use?
So So yeah, maybe two. So on the one hand, you can say it, to some extent, it really depends on the type of value conflict or the type of technology, what you can best do. But I think nevertheless, you can sketch, and I have another publication which I try to do, sketch a bit more general approach that you in general, in many cases, could choose. And that's, I think, if you have two conflicting values, so for example, you have fairness versus privacy, I think a first thing that you often want to do is to think about what I call thresholds. And that with that I mean, what is the minimal level of privacy you want to guarantee? What's the minimal level of fairness you want to have? And the idea is that below that level, it would be really ethically unacceptable to design this technology. So I think the first thing is that you will want to have this kind of thresholds, and you want to avoid any design that is outside these thresholds. So I think that can often be kind of first step. I think a second step can be, then you might still have conflicts or you cannot completely achieve it. And then you might have what I call innovation. And with innovation, I mean actually that you look for new technical solutions that better meet these values. And I think at that stage, it is actually also good to have a bit of conflict because it makes you more creative, thinking about possible solutions. And then at some stage, you might say, well, these are my options. I'm not going to find any more new options. And I think at that stage, things like balancing or multi-criteria analysis, but more balancing like techniques are better. So I think there's really a kind of order. First get out what is really unacceptable, then try to find new, better solutions. And then at some point, you have to make choices, and some form of balancing might be unavoidable, I would say.
So balancing would be really the last,
yeah,
kind of the last option you have. You know, you
yeah,
just decide to.
Yeah.
You don't have like you cannot like identify what is like more like the most important, like for example in case of value conflicts that are, you know, really really perfect balance, I'd say. So in this case, you're going to use the balancing techniques because you cannot really like choose between one and another.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think in practice, people often might quickly go to balancing because they feel we cannot.
Yeah.
But I think it is better, first of all, also to think about kind of minimal ethical boundaries, and even independent from the conflict. And that could be that in the end, you cannot meet all minimal boundaries, and then you have a really hard problem. And then you have, ethicists would call it a dilemma. But not all conflicts are dilemmas, but sometimes you might have a dilemma, and then you might have to think really hard. But I think nevertheless, it is important to think about these boundaries. And the other thing is indeed to think of new solutions. And of course, it will depend. Sometimes you don't have the time to look for new solutions, or you don't have the means. So I'm not saying that's always possible. But certainly, if you're designing new technologies or you're doing more research aimed at long-term solutions, you certainly have this room. And you should use that room for thinking about new ways of dealing with conflicting values.
Just to come back to the new solutions you mentioned. Like, do you mean technical solution or even organizational solutions, or what would be?
Yeah,
I think like innovation, but innovation in terms of what?
Yeah, I think I say solutions indeed. I mean, this can be technical solutions, but it can also institutional solutions, or so new institutions, or maybe even new laws, for example. So I mean it very broad. Any type of new way of dealing with the conflict, and sometimes this can be technical, but sometimes it can be better to think about more what you might call institutional solutions, or solutions that use the law to create better balances between values.
Yes, yeah. And I think it is really important because, like for example, with the cybersecurity, like for data, for example, and in general, we sometimes see that it is not really like a technological problems, but it's often related to the organization of the structure of the company or the organization. So like innovation doesn't only involve technology, but also the things around.
Yeah.
Yes.
I fully agree. I think that's important to stress it, because it might sound that you can solve all the problems with technology. That's not what I mean. I mean to say there might be other ways, and sometimes I mean technology might not be a good idea. So I'm certainly. But at the same time, it is interesting to think about technologies that can better meet our conflicting values. So I would certainly not rule that out, but it is certainly not just that. It is more than that. Yeah.
Okay, and so it's perfect for our last question already. So do you think that the model of value clusters in cybersecurity could be integrated in data governance? And what would be the advantage of such a thing?
Yes. So I'm not an expert on data governance, but I'm inclined to think that it has all kinds of implications if you think in this way. So data governance often stress these principles like findability, the FAIR principles, findability, accessibility, interoperability, reuse, or confidentiality. But I think a lot of data governance do not really always address the broader ethical issues. So even not always privacy issues, I think. So for example, to mention one thing, if you understand privacy not just as confidentiality, but privacy more as the right of people to determine what information is shared with whom about them. And you, for example, also have this with medical data so people sometimes can volunteer to share their medical data for scientific research. And we typically also, according to the GDPR, we should give informed consent, but we should also be able to withdraw informed consent later on. Now, one of the issues I have understood is the way these data are being stored, medical data, actually is not an infrastructure that allows informed consent, or there is not a kind of label on these data whether people have given informed consent and people can take that label away, so to say. Now, this is already a quite clear implication if you think through better, even something relatively simple still, privacy as informed consent, that I think is not systematically addressed in data governance. It would just require other data governance structures. And probably this is even more true if you start thinking about accountability. Maybe you want to have things like blockchain-like things for accountability, what happens with data. So I think, so I haven't thought it through systematically, but I think that there are actually huge implications for how you store data or for data governance.
Yeah, I would add that there would be this kind of views could be like integrated in this, you know, when you think about like data life, like from the beginning, from the gathering to the destruction of data, you should be like, I think you should be able to include this notion of values conflicts and be able to address some of concerns that data governance as it is now is not able to address yet. So I think it's really
maybe to mention one thing more that I'm not sure, but it might be also controversial. But I think a lot of how we deal with data is that we should keep as much data, or we should just retain them as much as possible. And there's interesting issues about that, also in relation to privacy. So you might actually argue that our data infrastructure should actually have something like data decay or data, maybe after 50 years, just like in the physical world, become inaccessible or worse. Maybe we should have something similar with data in our system so that we can forget things. Now that might have disadvantages, but it might also have interesting advantages. So I'm not saying that we should necessarily, but I'm just pointing this out that if you think about it, there can be far-reaching consequences how we deal with data. So, I mean, and this relates, for example, to this right to be forgotten, and that's now also an important concern. But you can also say one of the reasons that it comes into being is because the way we have designed our data infrastructures, namely in order so that nothing gets forgotten. that's the kind of basic way we have approached our data infrastructures. And you can question whether that is necessarily the best approach, given, for example, privacy concerns, but also that in normal human life, forgetting has an important also interpersonal role. So, okay.
but also implying like also involving fairness and accountability as well. So like
yeah. Actually, it might, you might say it might undermine accountability to some extent, but it might also be fair that we forget things that went wrong, or it might. I think if you think about interpersonal relations, forgetting is one of the ways why we can live together. If you would never forget, some things that have happened in the past might be so worse that people cannot never live together again. So forgetting actually has an important function in our social life.
Oh, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation again, and thank you for having delivered such an interesting answers to my questions to the questions of the audience as well.